Kang Ji-hoon died the way most modern men die, without noticing the significance of it, quietly, mid-sentence, staring at a spreadsheet of hop yields for a microbrewery that would never open. He had spent 15 years learning fermentation the hard way, chasing the perfect balance of bitterness and body, building a small craft beer brand that big corporations swallowed before it could breathe. His last coherent thought was not fear, but a bitter kind of tiredness, the feeling of a man who understood a craft completely and still lost to money that understood nothing at all. He woke up smelling mud, rot, and unwashed fur. His new body was small, weak, and green-skinned, with tusks barely poking past his lower lip and arms too thin to hold a spear properly. He was Yun Ba-woo now, or rather, the orc who had once carried that name before dying of fever at 17. The village around him was called Diakgol, a scattering of leaning huts on the edge of a stinking swamp, where the poorest and most despised orc clan on the continent had been dumped generations ago by people who did not want them anywhere near civilization. Ji-hoon, now Ba-woo, understood within hours that this was not a fantasy adventure waiting to reward him. It was survival at its most basic. The water in the village well was brown and smelled of sulfur. Children coughed constantly. An old orc named Choi Diakpal, missing half his teeth, vomited behind a hut while his daughter Han Sua tried uselessly to hold his shoulders steady. The drink everyone shared was a grayish, sour slop fermented by accident in open clay pots, more poison than refreshment, kept only because the swamp water was worse. Ba-woo's first real shock came when he walked past the village storage hut and found sacks of grain half-rotted from moisture, useless, thrown into a pile to be burned. Nobody understood preservation. Nobody understood boiling water to kill what made people sick. In his old life, this would have been an obvious first lecture in any homebrewing class: sanitation before flavor, safety before pleasure. Here, it was knowledge nobody in 1,000 miles possessed. Then he saw it, genuinely saw it, while wandering past the tree line behind the village at dusk. A spring, cold and startlingly clear, bubbled up from beneath a cluster of rocks untouched by the swamp's filth. Around it, climbing wild and unchecked over dead branches, grew vines with small green cone-shaped flowers that gave off a sharp, familiar, resinous smell the moment he crushed one between his fingers. Hops. Or close enough to hops that his hands remembered the scent before his mind confirmed it. His heart, still adjusting to being an orc's heart, pounded with something he hadn't felt in years: the electricity of recognizing an opportunity nobody else could see. He ran, or rather stumbled at speed, toward the old grain shed at the edge of the village, a crumbling structure nobody used anymore because its roof leaked and its walls smelled of mildew. Inside, half buried under broken tools and dust, sat 3 massive clay vessels, cracked but structurally sound, each large enough to hold hundreds of liters. Fermentation vessels. Forgotten, ignored, treated as junk for as long as anyone could remember. Ba-woo sat down right there in the dust and started laughing, quietly, almost hysterically. A clean spring. Wild hops. Enormous fermentation vats. A village dying from bad water and worse food, sitting on top of everything needed to fix both problems, and not one person in 100 years had connected the dots. He tried to explain this to the village elder that same evening, a scarred, broad-shouldered orc named Baek Chul-wong who had led Diakgol for over a decade through nothing but failed raids and slow starvation. Ba-woo spoke carefully, choosing simple words, describing boiling water, adding the bitter plant, letting it sit, drinking something safer than swamp sludge. Chul-wong's response was immediate and humiliating. He grabbed Ba-woo by the collar in front of half the village and called him a soft-headed coward hiding behind clever words instead of learning to fight like every orc before him. Someone in the crowd shouted that only weak humans and cowards drank bitter poison willingly. Another spat near Ba-woo's feet and said the boy had clearly lost what little sense fever hadn't already burned out of him. It was, without exaggeration, the most public humiliation Ji-hoon had experienced in either life. Standing there, dizzy, tusks aching from where Chul-wong's grip had bruised his jaw, he understood something crucial: bitterness, to these people, meant danger. Every poisonous plant in the swamp was bitter. Every rotten thing was bitter. Asking them to trust a bitter drink was, in their minds, asking them to trust poison willingly. That night, 3 young orcs found him sitting alone by the dead fire pit, nursing his bruised pride. 2 were considered useless by village standards: young Woo-sik, a thin boy mocked for being too weak to hunt, and Oh-ji-min, a girl dismissed because she preferred fixing broken tools over holding a spear. The third, Han Sua, had just watched her father vomit blood-tinged bile earlier that same day and had nothing left to lose by listening to a stranger's strange promises. Ba-woo told them the plan plainly: boiling water killed whatever made people sick, the bitter plant helped preserve the boiled water longer, and the process, while it happened to eventually make something people might actually enjoy drinking, was primarily about survival, not pleasure. He didn't dress it up with false confidence. He told them clearly that he might fail, that the first attempts could taste terrible, and that this only worked if they were willing to be laughed at while trying it in secret. Woo-sik shrugged and said he was already laughed at daily, so nothing new there. Jimin was more interested in figuring out how to seal the cracked clay vessels properly than in any promise of miracle water. Suwa simply said that if there was even a small chance her father wouldn't have to suffer through another bad season, she would carry buckets from the spring every night if she had to. Over the following days, the four of them worked quietly, avoiding Chulwong's attention. Bawu instructed Woo-sik and Suwa on hauling clean spring water instead of the usual swamp draw, though he framed it only as trying something new rather than announcing grand plans that would invite more mockery. Jimin, meanwhile, patched the largest cracked vessel using clay, ash, and stubbornness, testing it with water until it held without leaking. Bawu harvested a modest bundle of the wild hop-like flowers, crushing them just enough to release their oil without destroying the whole batch, uncertain of exact ratios but relying on instincts sharpened by years of real brewing experience. He built a crude fire pit near the shed, using stones to hold a large pot steady, and began the slow, careful process of boiling spring water, adding the bitter plant, and preparing the mixture for what he hoped would ferment safely inside the old vat rather than become another useless failure. As the fire crackled and the first pot of water began to steam under the darkening sky, Bawu looked at the three tired, skeptical faces around him, people the rest of the village considered useless, weak, or broken, and felt something settle inside his chest that had nothing to do with nostalgia for his old human life. This was not going to be easy. The grain was poor, the tools were worse, and the entire village despised the idea before it even had a name. But for the first time since waking up in this small, weak, tusked body, Kang Ji-hoon, now fully becoming Yoon Bawu, felt the same electric certainty he'd felt the day he opened his first tiny brewery back in his old world. He was standing at the beginning of something the world around him could not yet imagine. Somewhere in the dark, the first pot of water began to boil. The first batch nearly killed everything Bawu had built in a single week. It happened on the fifth night, when the boiled water, hop-like flowers, and wild grain mixture had been sitting in the patched clay vessel long enough that the surface had started to bubble in a way Bawu initially took as a good sign. His old-world knowledge told him fermentation meant activity, meant yeast doing its work, meant progress. What he had failed to account for was the wild yeast strains in this world behaving nothing like the cultivated ones he understood, combined with grain that had been improperly dried, carrying rot spores that thrived in the warm, wet vessel. The pressure built quietly under a loose wooden lid Jimin had fitted only days before. Bawu had gone to check on the vessel at dawn, crouching close to inspect the color of the liquid, when it happened. The buildup released all at once, the crude lid launching into the air, and a violent spray of foul, sour liquid exploded across the shed, coating the walls, the floor, and most of Bawu's face and chest in a stinking, half-fermented mess. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, like spoiled fruit mixed with rotten eggs, thick enough to make Woo-sik gag from 3 meters away. The noise alone brought half the village running. By the time Chulwong arrived, shoving through the small crowd gathering at the shed entrance, Bawu was standing there drenched, humiliated, and coughing, next to a ruined vessel and a puddle of what looked like vomit spreading across the dirt floor. Chulwong didn't need to say much. He simply looked at the mess, looked at Bawu, and asked loudly enough for everyone to hear whether this was the great plan meant to save the village, poisoning the grain shed instead of the swamp water. Someone in the crowd laughed. Someone else muttered that the boy had wasted grain they couldn't afford to lose, grain that could have fed 3 families for a week. An older woman spat near the doorway and said this was proof enough that fever damage doesn't heal, no matter how confidently a boy talks. Suwa tried to defend him, pointing out that her father hadn't been sick since drinking the boiled water days earlier, but her voice was drowned out by louder, angrier voices demanding the shed be shut down and the wasted grain accounted for. Chulwong ordered Bawu to clean the mess himself, alone, and warned him that if he wasted grain again, he would be banned from the storage hut entirely, treated as nothing more than another useless mouth to feed. Bawu spent that entire day scrubbing dried, stinking residue off the clay walls, his hands raw, his pride in worse shape than his knuckles. Ji-hoon's old-world expertise screamed at him that this failure made complete sense. Of course wild yeast behaved unpredictably, of course improperly stored grain introduced contamination, of course a first attempt without proper tools would go wrong somewhere. But knowing the reason didn't erase the public shame of standing drenched in fermented sludge while an entire village decided he was exactly the kind of useless dreamer they always suspected. That night, alone by the dead fire, Bawu allowed himself exactly 1 hour of genuine despair before forcing himself back into problem-solving mode, a habit carried over from years of running a small brewery through supplier failures, bad batches, and thin margins. He listed, mentally, everything that had gone wrong: grain quality too poor and improperly dried, no reliable way to measure fermentation progress, no proper seal to control pressure buildup, no clean environment to prevent wild contamination, and no understanding among his 3 helpers of why any specific step mattered rather than just following instructions blindly. Wusik found him still awake near dawn and admitted quietly that half the village now openly mocked him for helping the poison boy, and that his own mother had told him to stop wasting time on foolishness that would get them exiled if it kept costing grain. Jimin, arriving shortly after with dirt still under her fingernails from failed vessel repairs, said bluntly that the crack in the vessel base had likely widened from the pressure, and asked whether Bawu actually understood what caused the explosion or was simply guessing his way forward. It was, oddly, the most useful question anyone had asked him since arriving in this world. Bawu explained as clearly as he could, using comparisons to bread rising, sealed jars of preserved vegetables bursting if not vented properly, and living organisms consuming sugar and producing gas as a natural byproduct. Jimin, practical by nature, immediately understood the mechanical problem even without grasping the biological one: pressure needed release, not a full seal, and the seal needed to allow slow venting rather than trapping everything until failure. Sua, meanwhile, brought news that her father, despite the vomiting scare earlier that week, remained the healthiest he had been in over a month, still drinking boiled water daily despite Chulwon's ban on further shed activity. That small, quiet fact mattered more than any argument Bawu could construct. The boiling process itself, separate from the failed fermentation attempt, was already working exactly as intended. Over the following days, Bawu made a critical decision: separate the 2 goals that had gotten dangerously tangled in everyone's mind. Boiling water for safety needed to continue immediately, openly if possible, framed simply as cleaner drinking water without mentioning fermentation at all. The more ambitious project, actual beer, flavor, something people might eventually choose to drink for pleasure rather than necessity, would continue quietly, away from village eyes, until it produced something undeniable rather than another public disaster. Getting proper grain remained the largest obstacle. The village's poor drying methods meant most stored grain carried some degree of rot or moisture damage, useless for reliable fermentation. Bawu spent an afternoon studying the drying racks currently in use: flimsy wooden frames set too close to damp ground, catching moisture from the swamp air overnight and undoing whatever the sun accomplished during the day. He proposed elevating the racks higher, angling them to catch better airflow, and covering them during humid nights, changes so simple that Jimin implemented them within a single afternoon without needing Chulwong's approval since it barely qualified as unusual behavior. Meanwhile, Wusik quietly diverted a small portion of grain considered too low quality for eating, grain the village would have discarded anyway, toward Bawu's next attempt, arguing correctly that using already rejected grain wouldn't draw suspicion or accusations of theft from useful food stores. Bawu also redesigned the vessel seal entirely, using a thinner wooden lid wrapped loosely with treated cloth Jimin sourced from a torn and used blanket, allowing gas to escape slowly through small gaps rather than building dangerous pressure. He reduced the batch size significantly, choosing caution over ambition, preferring a smaller, controllable failure over another explosive disaster that could end this project permanently. The second attempt began 8 days after the first disaster, conducted in near-total secrecy inside the same battered shed, now cleaned obsessively by Bawu himself to eliminate any lingering contamination. He carefully selected only the driest grain from the newly improved racks, crushed a modest amount of the hop-like flours with slightly less aggression than before, and boiled the spring water longer this time, remembering, with a flash of old-world clarity, that longer, more thorough boiling reduced unwanted bacterial competition significantly. As the mixture settled into the smaller, better-sealed vessel under the loosely wrapped lid, Bawu sat back against the shed wall, exhausted, humiliated by the previous week, but strangely calmer than before. Wusik asked quietly whether this attempt would actually work this time. Bawu, staring at the faint, slow bubbles rising gently through the liquid rather than violently churning as before, answered honestly that he didn't know for certain, but that everything they'd changed addressed exactly the mistakes that caused the first failure. Jimin, arms crossed, studying the vessel with genuine focus rather than obligation, said simply that failing once didn't mean failing twice, provided someone actually learned something from the first mistake instead of repeating it blindly. Sua, standing near the shed entrance, glanced nervously toward the village center where Chulwon's watchful presence loomed over everything, and asked how long they needed to keep this hidden before finding out whether it worked at all. Ba Wu didn't have an exact answer, only an estimate based on fermentation patterns he remembered from his old life, adjusted uncertainly for whatever unpredictable differences this strange new world's ingredients might introduce. All four of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that this quiet, smaller vessel bubbling faintly in the dark represented not just a second attempt at beer, but possibly their last real chance before Cholwong's patience and the village's tolerance for wasted grain ran out completely. 12 days after the second attempt began, Ba Wu lifted the loosely wrapped lid with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold but from the accumulated weight of 2 failures pressing against whatever confidence he had left. The liquid inside had changed color, darker than water, faintly cloudy, with a smell that was sharp and bitter but not rotten, not the sour vomit stench of the first disaster. He dipped a small wooden cup into the vessel, staring at the liquid for a long moment before Wusik, impatient, asked if he was going to drink it or just admire it forever. Ba Wu drank first, alone, refusing to let Jimin, Sua, or Wusik risk anything until he confirmed it wouldn't immediately harm them. The taste hit him hard, rough and unrefined, bitter in a way that made his tongue curl, but underneath the roughness sat something unmistakably familiar, a grain sweetness balanced against the sharp bite of the hop-like flowers, something that resembled actual beer rather than swamp sludge or fermented poison. It was crude, unbalanced, and far from anything he would have served in his old brewery, but it was real. It worked. He didn't announce success immediately. Instead, over the following 2 days, he tested small amounts on himself repeatedly, watching for any sign of illness, before finally allowing Wusik and Jimin a taste, then Sua. Their reactions varied. Wusik grimaced and said it tasted like something that shouldn't be swallowed on purpose, while Jimin, more analytical, admitted it was strange but not unpleasant once you got past the initial bitterness. Sua simply asked if her father could try it, given his weakened stomach and his ongoing improvement from boiled water alone. That request became the turning point. Ba Wu agreed cautiously, giving Diakpal only a small portion, watching him carefully for hours afterward. Nothing bad happened. Instead, Diakpal, who had barely eaten solid food in days due to stomach pain, asked quietly for a second small cup the following morning, claiming it settled his stomach better than plain water alone. Word spread slowly at first, through exactly the kind of quiet village whispering that Ba Wu had hoped to avoid a month earlier but now desperately needed. An elderly woman named Jang Misuk, known throughout Diakgol for chronic stomach ailments blamed vaguely on bad blood, asked Sua directly whether the strange drink her father praised was truly safe. Ba Wu, present for the conversation, offered her a small taste rather than a full explanation, understanding that skepticism born from years of swamp poison could not be argued away with words alone. Misuk's reaction became, unintentionally, the first real turning point for public opinion. She drank the small offered portion, made a face at the bitterness, but admitted afterward that her stomach felt calmer than it had in weeks. She specifically noted, loudly enough for nearby villagers to hear, that she hadn't felt this settled since before the swamp water sickness had worsened the previous season. Over the following 10 days, without any dramatic announcement or confrontation with Cholwong, a slow, quiet shift occurred throughout Diakgol. Several villagers who had previously mocked Ba Wu openly began asking Wusik, considered less threatening than Ba Wu himself, whether there was more of that bitter drink available. Jimin found herself fielding questions about the sealed vessel design, as villagers noticed her patched, cracked pottery no longer leaked and wondered how she'd managed it. More importantly, illness in the village began dropping noticeably. Ba Wu had insisted from the beginning that anyone drinking the boiled water separate entirely from the fermented beer, avoid raw swamp water whenever possible. Combined with the small but growing group now regularly drinking the mild beer instead of the old sour slop, stomach ailments that had plagued nearly a third of the village for years started becoming less frequent. Children who previously suffered weekly bouts of vomiting or diarrhea began going stretches of 10, 15 days without incident. This shift did not go unnoticed by Cholwong, though his reaction remained guarded rather than immediately hostile. He watched from a distance as more villagers gathered near the shed at dusk, no longer openly mocking Ba Wu but instead waiting, almost sheepishly, for a small portion of whatever batch had finished fermenting that week. Ba Wu, aware of Cholwong's suspicious observation, made a deliberate choice not to confront him directly or demand recognition, instead allowing results to speak louder than any argument he could construct. The real emotional turning point came roughly 3 weeks after the first successful batch, during a village gathering originally called to discuss an unrelated dispute over hunting territory. Diakpal, previously known throughout Diakgol as one of the sickliest adults in the village, stood during the gathering and spoke unprompted, telling everyone present that he hadn't suffered stomach pain in over 2 weeks, longer than any stretch he could remember in the past 3 years. He credited it directly to the boy's bitter water, refusing to let Chulwung redirect the conversation back toward hunting matters. Several other villagers, emboldened by Diat Pal's public statement, added their own smaller observations: fewer headaches, steadier energy, children sleeping through the night without stomach cramps waking them. Chulwung, cornered by public sentiment shifting visibly in real time, could not simply dismiss an entire gathering's testimony without appearing foolish or, worse, actively hostile towards something clearly helping his people survive. Bawu, standing quietly near the back of the gathering rather than pushing himself forward, felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with vindication. This wasn't about being right. It was about watching people who had suffered quietly for years finally experiencing something resembling relief, something resembling dignity, simply because someone had finally paid attention to what their environment was actually doing to them. That night, Chulwung approached Bawu directly for the first time without hostility, though his tone remained gruff and guarded rather than warm. He asked bluntly how much of the drink could realistically be made, and whether it required resources the village couldn't spare. Bawu answered honestly, current production remains small, limited by grain quality, vessel capacity, and the sheer amount of manual labor required for boiling, crushing, and monitoring fermentation across multiple batches. This admission led directly into the next problem, one Bawu had already anticipated but hadn't yet voiced aloud. Even with growing acceptance inside the village, actual expansion required significantly more grain than Diakul currently produced, grain that couldn't simply be diverted from already thin food stores without risking hunger elsewhere. The village, despite improved health, remained fundamentally poor, farming inefficiently on marginal swampland with no irrigation, no crop rotation, and minimal storage capacity beyond what Jimin's small shed improvements had already fixed. Bawu explained this limitation carefully to Chulwung, framing it not as an obstacle to abandon the project but as the next necessary step forward. If the village wanted more of this drink enough to matter, enough to eventually consider trading it beyond Diakul's borders, they needed better farming first, not more fermentation experiments. Chulwung, visibly uncomfortable discussing farming reforms he barely understood, admitted grudgingly that he'd rather trust results he could see than continue insulting whatever had clearly improved his people's health over the past month. It wasn't full endorsement, and it certainly wasn't respect, but it was something Bawu hadn't expected this soon: reluctant, practical cooperation from the very orc who had grabbed him by the collar in public humiliation just weeks earlier. Later that night, gathered again around the shed with Wusik, Jimin, and Suwa, Bawu laid out the next phase plainly. Clean water and safe beer had proven their worth, but proving worth inside one small village wasn't enough anymore. Without better grain production, without proper drying, storage, and eventually irrigation, none of this could scale beyond a handful of grateful villagers sneaking cups at dusk. Suwa asked quietly whether this meant even more work than before, given how exhausted all four of them already were from weeks of secretive brewing and constant vigilance against failure. Bawu admitted honestly that yes, it meant more work, likely harder work than anything they'd attempted so far, because farming reform touched every family in Diakul rather than just a handful of curious drinkers. Jimin, ever practical, pointed out that convincing an entire village to change farming habits they'd followed for generations would likely prove far harder than convincing a few sick people to try bitter water when nothing else had worked. Bawu didn't disagree. He simply looked toward the dark swamp beyond the village edge, toward fields that could theoretically produce far more than they currently did if properly managed, and said quietly that Diakul had spent generations being called lazy and incapable, when in reality nobody had ever given them the tools or knowledge to prove otherwise. Tonight, for the first time since arriving in this world, Bawu allowed himself something resembling genuine hope rather than desperate survival instinct. The beer worked. The village believed, however cautiously. Now came the harder part: building the foundation beneath that fragile belief before it could collapse under the weight of its own growing ambition. The morning after Chulwung's grudging cooperation, Bawu walked the fields surrounding Diakul properly for the first time since arriving in this world, no longer as a confused newcomer but as someone actively looking for solutions. What he found confirmed his fears. The fields sat low and waterlogged near the swamp edge, planted without any real rotation, the same depleted patches of soil used year after year without rest or replenishment. Irrigation consisted of villagers hauling buckets by hand whenever rain failed to cooperate, an exhausting, inefficient system that left crops perpetually stressed and undersized. He gathered Woo-sik, Jimin, and Suwa again that evening, along with two older farmers Suwa trusted, Moon Gyute, a weathered man who had farmed the same stubborn plot for over 20 years, and his wife Baek Hyran, who managed what little seed storage the village maintained. Bawo explained, as simply as possible, concepts that felt almost embarrassingly basic from his old-world perspective but represented genuine revelation here: rotating crops to prevent soil exhaustion, digging simple channels to direct water more efficiently rather than relying entirely on manual carrying, and elevating grain storage to prevent the rot that had ruined so much of the village's harvest in previous seasons. Gyute listened with visible skepticism, arguing that his father and grandfather had farmed exactly this way for decades, and questioning why a boy barely out of childhood suddenly knew better than generations of accumulated experience. Bawo didn't argue with tradition directly. Instead, he proposed testing the changes on a single small plot first, isolated enough that failure wouldn't threaten the village's main food supply, but visible enough that success couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Hyran, more pragmatic than her husband, pointed out that their storage losses alone justified trying something different, since nearly a third of last season's harvest had rotted before winter even arrived. She agreed to test elevated storage racks similar to what Jimin had already built for the brewing grain, provided Bawo helped construct them properly rather than leaving her to guess at unfamiliar designs. Over the following 2 weeks, Bawo split his attention between 3 parallel efforts, pushing himself and his small group of helpers harder than at any point since his arrival. Jimin led construction of improved storage structures, adapting the shed design that had already proven successful, now scaled up to handle the village's broader grain supply rather than just Bawo's private brewing stock. Woo-sik, surprisingly capable with physical labor despite his earlier reputation as weak, organized a small crew digging shallow irrigation channels from a diverted section of the clean spring, directing water more efficiently toward the test plot without relying entirely on manual bucket transport. Bawo himself focused on soil management, explaining crop rotation concepts to Gyute using comparisons the older farmer could understand, resting land the way a tired hunter needed rest between long chases, rather than pushing the same muscles until they gave out entirely. He introduced simple composting using kitchen scraps and animal waste that had previously just been discarded, another concept so basic in his old world it felt strange explaining it as revolutionary information here. The test plot, planted with a rotation Bawo designed based on incomplete but workable knowledge of what grew well in similar swampy conditions back home, showed visible differences within just 3 weeks. The soil retained moisture better without becoming waterlogged, thanks to the shallow drainage channels Woo-sik's crew had dug. The rotated crops grew fuller, greener, less stunted than the exhausted soil in older fields nearby. Gyute, watching this transformation with growing disbelief, admitted openly one evening that he hadn't seen a plot look this healthy in over a decade of farming the same stubborn ground. His admission, spoken loudly enough for several nearby villagers to overhear, did more to shift opinion than any argument Bawo could have constructed through words alone. This success, however, immediately created a larger, more complicated problem. Scaling these improvements beyond a single test plot required significantly more labor than Diakol's already stretched population could easily provide. Digging irrigation channels across multiple fields, constructing enough elevated storage for the entire village's harvest, and maintaining rotation schedules across land currently farmed by dozens of separate families all demanded coordination the village had never attempted before. Chulwung, watching the test plot's success with the same guarded interest he'd shown toward the beer weeks earlier, called a village gathering to discuss whether to expand these changes village-wide. The gathering proved contentious. Several older farmers, echoing Gyute's initial skepticism, argued that changing farming methods risked the entire harvest if something went wrong, unlike the small, contained test plot that hadn't threatened anyone's survival. A particularly vocal opponent, a broad-shouldered farmer named Ko Sangmin, argued loudly that Bawo was a fever-addled boy playing at knowledge he didn't actually possess, and that risking the village's entire food supply on unproven methods represented exactly the kind of reckless thinking that had gotten previous leaders killed through failed raids and poor decisions. Several villagers murmured agreement, clearly torn between the visible success of the test plot and genuine fear of risking their only food source on unfamiliar methods. Bawo, rather than arguing directly against Sangmin's fear, proposed a compromise: expand gradually, field by field, rather than converting everything simultaneously. Families willing to test the new methods on portions of their own land could do so voluntarily, while those preferring traditional methods could continue unchanged until results became undeniable. This approach reduced immediate risk while still allowing broader adoption to spread naturally as success accumulated. Chulwung, surprising Bawo slightly, backed this compromise publicly, stating that he'd rather see gradual proof than reckless gambling with the entire village's survival, but that he'd also rather see progress than stubborn refusal to consider anything new. His endorsement, however reluctant, carried enough weight to quiet most remaining opposition, though Sangmin continued muttering complaints throughout the following weeks. Over the following month, roughly a third of Diakol's farming families adopted at least some version of the new methods, drawn primarily by visible results rather than persuasive argument. Storage losses dropped noticeably as elevated, better ventilated structures replaced the old ground-level piles that had rotted so much grain in previous seasons. Irrigation channels, though crude by any standard Bawu remembered from his old life, reduced the exhausting manual labor of water carrying significantly, freeing up time previously spent on basic survival tasks. This shift created an unexpected secondary effect that Bawu hadn't fully anticipated. As farming efficiency improved, a small but genuine surplus began accumulating for the first time in Diakol's recent memory. Grain that would have previously rotted or been consumed immediately out of scarcity now remained available beyond immediate needs, creating exactly the resource Bawu needed to scale beer production beyond small, secretive batches. He approached Chulwung directly about this surplus, proposing that a modest portion be allocated specifically toward expanded brewing rather than immediate consumption or long-term storage alone. Chulwung, having witnessed both the health improvements from existing beer batches and the tangible farming success firsthand, agreed more readily than Bawu had expected, though he insisted on personally overseeing exactly how much grain got diverted to avoid any appearance of waste or favoritism. With this expanded grain allocation, Bawu, Jimin, Wusik, and Suwa began scaling production significantly, moving beyond the single small vessel that had produced their first successful batch toward multiple larger containers, each carefully sealed using the improved venting design Jimin had refined since the earlier explosive failure. Production still remained crude by any standard measure, but the increased scale meant, for the first time, that Diakol produced more beer than the village itself could immediately consume. This surplus raised an obvious question nobody in the village had seriously considered before: what to do with beer beyond what Diakol needed for its own health and habits. Bawu, remembering his old-world experience building a small brewery brand from nothing, understood immediately that this surplus represented opportunity rather than excess, provided it could reach buyers willing to pay for something Diakol currently gave away freely among its own people. That evening, watching villagers loading the first fully packed cart of sealed clay jugs meant for nothing more than internal storage rotation, Bawu pulled Wusik aside and asked quietly whether he'd ever traveled beyond Diakol's immediate swampland borders. Wusik admitted he'd gone as far as the nearest trading crossroads twice with his father years earlier, before his father had died in a failed raid that the village still spoke about only in hushed, embarrassed tones. Bawu nodded slowly, already calculating logistics in his head: how much surplus they could realistically spare without risking their own food security, what container designs would survive travel without breaking, and how a village universally known throughout the region as poor, backward, and incapable might possibly convince outsiders to try something as unfamiliar as orc-brewed beer. It was, he realized standing there in the fading evening light, an entirely new kind of problem, one that had nothing to do with fermentation chemistry or soil rotation. This was about trust, reputation, and convincing a world that had spent generations dismissing Diakol's people as worthless that they now had something genuinely worth buying. Suwa, noticing his distracted expression, asked what he was thinking about so intensely. Bawu answered honestly that they'd solved the problem of making something good. Now came the much harder problem of making the outside world believe it. Preparing the first trade expedition beyond Diakol took nearly 3 weeks, far longer than Bawu initially expected. Sealed clay jugs needed reinforced wrapping to survive travel over rough terrain without cracking, a problem Jimin solved by weaving thick reed padding around each container, tested repeatedly by deliberately dropping loaded jugs from a cart to see which designs survived. Wusik, drawing on his limited but real experience traveling with his late father, mapped the safest route toward the nearest trading crossroads, a modest waypoint town called Hanmakul where merchants, laborers, and travelers pass through regularly without the heavy scrutiny of larger cities. Chulwung, though still uneasy about risking village resources on something as uncertain as outside trade, allowed the expedition to proceed under strict conditions. Only a small portion of the surplus would travel, nothing that threatened the village's own food security, and Bawu would personally accompany the cart alongside Wusik and 2 young orcs chosen for their size and willingness to serve as informal guards rather than genuine warriors. Suwa stayed behind, tasked with maintaining brewing operations and caring for her father, while Jimin remained to continue refining vessel and storage improvements. The journey itself proved uneventful for the first day, the swamp gradually giving way to drier scrubland as they moved away from Diakol's borders. Bawo used the travel time to prepare Wusik for what awaited them, explaining basic principles of presentation and persuasion that felt almost absurdly simple from his old-world marketing experience but represented genuinely foreign concepts here, offering small free tastes before asking for payment, framing the product's strengths honestly rather than overselling qualities it didn't have, and remaining calm rather than defensive when facing inevitable initial mockery. Hanmakgal, when they arrived, proved exactly as unwelcoming as Bawo had feared. The moment their cart rolled into the modest trading square, several human merchants openly stared, whispering among themselves at the sight of orcs attempting to set up a stall rather than simply passing through as laborers or mercenaries. One older merchant, running a modest tavern supply stand nearby, laughed loudly enough for half the square to hear, asking whether the orcs planned to sell mud or manure, since everyone knew orcs produced nothing worth actual currency. Bawo, forcing down the sting of humiliation, ignored the comment entirely and focused on setting up their small stall properly, arranging clay cups for tasting rather than immediately pushing full jugs for sale. Wusik, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of open stares and muttered insults, asked quietly whether this had been a mistake, whether they should simply pack up and return home before things turned uglier. Bawo refused, reminding him that Diakgal's own villagers had reacted with identical scorn just months earlier, and that scorn alone hadn't stopped the beer from eventually proving itself. He poured small tasting portions and began offering them directly to passing laborers and travelers rather than merchants who had already decided their opinion before tasting anything. The first several attempts failed exactly as expected. Most people refused outright, unwilling to even try something openly associated with orcs. A group of young laborers walked past sneering, one spitting near the stall deliberately to express contempt. Bawo maintained composure, continuing to offer tastes patiently rather than reacting to provocation, understanding from old-world sales experience that visible frustration would only confirm every negative stereotype already working against them. The turning point arrived unexpectedly through a tired, dust-covered mercenary named Song Tae-hyun, part of a small caravan guard crew passing through Hanmakgal between contracts. Tae-hyun, apparently indifferent to social stigma after years of rough travel and questionable company, accepted a tasting cup mostly out of boredom rather than genuine interest, expecting to mock it afterward like everyone else nearby. Instead, he paused after drinking, visibly surprised, and asked bluntly what exactly this was, since it tasted stronger and more satisfying than the watered-down, overpriced ale most taverns along this route typically served. Bawo explained honestly, a beer brewed using clean spring water and wild hops, made in a small orc village that had spent months solving problems with basic sanitation and food safety before ever considering flavor as a priority. Tae-hyun, still skeptical about the source but genuinely impressed by the taste, asked for a second cup, then inquired about price for a full jug to share with his caravan crew later that evening. This single sale, modest as it was, shifted the entire atmosphere around their stall. Several other travelers, having watched Tae-hyun's visible enjoyment rather than disgust, grew curious enough to try small tastes themselves despite lingering discomfort about buying from orcs. By the end of that first day, Bawo and Wusik had sold considerably more than they'd expected, primarily to laborers, caravan guards, and travelers rather than the merchants and tavern owners who remained openly dismissive. The profit, converted into actual coin rather than village barter, represented genuine progress, small, but undeniably real evidence that outside markets could be reached despite Diakgal's reputation. That evening, however, brought their first genuine external threat. A local tax collector representing the regional baron's authority approached their stall just as they prepared to close for the night, demanding to know under what license they were selling goods within Hanmakgal's trading grounds. Bawo, caught off guard, admitted honestly that they possessed no formal license, having never anticipated needing one for what had started as a small experimental trade run. The collector, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Yeo Byung-chul, eyed their cart and remaining jugs with obvious suspicion, questioning aloud how a poor orc village had suddenly acquired enough surplus resources to travel and trade, hinting strongly that such sudden wealth likely came from theft or illegal raiding rather than legitimate production. He demanded immediate payment of a punitive fee, threatening confiscation of their entire remaining stock and cart if they refused or failed to produce adequate documentation proving legitimate ownership. Bawo recognized immediately the danger of this confrontation extending beyond simple bureaucracy into something that could threaten Diakgal's entire future. Arguing directly against Byung-chul's authority risked immediate confiscation or worse, while paying the demanded fee without negotiation would drain nearly all the profit they just earned, undermining the entire purpose of the trip. He chose a middle path, offering Byung-chul a private tasting sample along with a smaller, negotiated payment framed respectfully as an appreciation gift rather than outright bribery, while explaining calmly that Diakol had recently improved farming methods significantly, producing legitimate surplus rather than stolen goods. Byung-chul, tasting the beer privately away from public view, seemed genuinely surprised by its quality, though his suspicion didn't disappear entirely. He accepted the smaller payment reluctantly, warning explicitly that future trading within Hanmakgal or any territory under the Baron's authority would require proper documentation and considerably larger fees moving forward, hinting that ignoring this warning would result in far harsher consequences next time. Bawu understood immediately that this encounter represented only the beginning of a much larger, more complicated relationship with regional authority, one that would require careful navigation rather than naive optimism about simply being left alone to trade freely. That night, camped just outside Hanmakgal's borders to avoid additional attention, Wusik expressed relief that they'd avoided losing everything, but voiced genuine worry about returning to a system that seemed designed specifically to extract value from anyone without existing power or connections. Bawu agreed quietly, admitting that legitimate success now meant navigating exactly the kind of political and bureaucratic obstacles that had never threatened Diakol before, simply because nobody had ever considered the village worth exploiting when it possessed nothing valuable to extract. Counting their earnings carefully by firelight, converting rough coin into a mental estimate of how much additional grain, tools, or brewing equipment it might purchase, Bawu felt the strange mixture of genuine excitement and creeping dread that came with real progress. They had proven, undeniably, that people outside Diakol would pay for what they'd built. But that same proof had already attracted exactly the kind of attention Bawu had feared from the very beginning, attention from those who controlled formal power, and who clearly wouldn't allow a poor orc village to profit quietly without eventually demanding their share, one way or another. As the fire burned low and Wusik drifted toward uneasy sleep nearby, Bawu stared up at unfamiliar stars, calculating not just profits and grain surpluses anymore, but the much larger, more dangerous question of how long Diakol could keep growing before someone more powerful than a single tax collector decided their success had become impossible to ignore. News of the successful Hanmakgal trip spread through Diakol quickly, and within 2 months, regular trading runs became an established routine rather than a risky experiment. Bawu expanded the operation carefully, training additional villagers in tasting-based sales techniques while Jimin redesigned transport containers to survive longer journeys toward slightly larger settlements. Production scaled correspondingly, with 3 dedicated brewing crews now operating rotating batches using expanded storage and slightly improved grain quality from the ongoing farming reforms. This growth, however, attracted exactly the kind of attention Bawu had anticipated but hoped to delay. Word of orc beer outperforming cheap tavern ale began circulating among caravan crews and laborers across several trading routes, eventually reaching the ears of established brewing guilds in the larger city of Kianrim, roughly a week's travel from Diakol. These guilds, comfortable with decades of unchallenged local dominance, viewed any outside competitor with suspicion, but a competitor associated with orcs specifically triggered something closer to outrage than mere business concern. The guild's most aggressive response came through a young, ambitious brewer named Han Jae-wook, heir to one of Kianrim's most respected brewing houses. Jae-wook, initially amused rather than threatened, visited a trading post personally to sample the orc beer everyone kept discussing, expecting to confirm his assumption that it was crude, undrinkable swill exaggerated by uneducated laborers with no real palate. Instead, tasting it privately, Jae-wook found himself genuinely unsettled. The beer was rough, certainly less refined than his family's carefully aged products, but it possessed a bold, satisfying character that appealed directly to exactly the market his own guild had never bothered targeting: laborers, soldiers, and travelers who wanted something substantial and honest rather than delicate and expensive. Worse, it was significantly cheaper than anything his guild produced at comparable strength. Rather than dismissing the threat, Jae-wook made a calculated decision to eliminate it before it grew further, beginning with an offer rather than outright attack. He traveled personally toward Diakol's trading route, intercepting Bawu during a routine trip, and proposed buying the recipe outright for a sum that would have seemed impossibly large just months earlier. He framed it generously, suggesting Bawu could retire from constant travel risk while still profiting handsomely, implying that continued independent competition against an established guild would eventually end badly regardless of product quality. Bawu, recognizing the offer as both genuine opportunity and thinly veiled threat, refused politely but firmly, explaining that this wasn't simply about profit but about proving something for an entire village that had been dismissed for generations. Jae-wook's expression shifted subtly at this refusal, his initial respect curdling slightly into something more personal, though he maintained outward composure, warning simply that he hoped Bawu understood exactly what he was choosing to fight against. The guild's retaliation began within weeks, employing tactics far more sophisticated than simple market competition. Rumors started circulating in Hanmakgal and neighboring trading posts claiming orc beer caused strange behavioral changes, exaggerated stories about drinkers becoming inexplicably aggressive or unwell after extended consumption, deliberately playing into existing prejudice about orc-associated products being inherently dangerous or unnatural. Simultaneously, guild-aligned merchants began undercutting prices specifically wherever Diakgal's trading crews operated, absorbing short-term losses deliberately to squeeze out the smaller operation before it could establish permanent market presence. A shipment of Diakgal's brewing equipment, ordered through a previously reliable supplier, mysteriously failed to arrive on schedule, later discovered to have been intentionally redirected through bribery arranged by guild intermediaries. Bawu recognized these coordinated attacks immediately as deliberate sabotage rather than coincidental misfortune, drawing uncomfortable parallels to corporate tactics he remembered from his old world, where established players routinely used financial pressure and reputation attacks to eliminate smaller competitors before they gained enough traction to matter. Rather than panicking, he gathered his core team Wusik, Jimin, Suwa, and now several additional trusted villagers who had proven themselves through the expanding operation to plan a coordinated response. Their first countermeasure addressed the damaging rumors directly. Bawu organized public tastings specifically targeting skeptical merchants and respected community figures in affected trading posts, offering transparent demonstrations of the brewing process itself rather than simply asking people to trust unfamiliar claims. Watching grain, water, and hops transform through visible, explainable steps did more to dispel supernatural fearmongering than any verbal denial could have accomplished. Against the guild's price undercutting, Bawu made a strategic decision that drew directly on his old-world business experience, rather than competing purely on price, which Diakgal couldn't sustainably win against a wealthier established guild. He diversified the product line into distinct tiers targeting different customer needs. A lighter, cheaper version aimed specifically at laborers and common travelers who valued affordability above all else. A stronger, more robust version marketed toward mercenaries and soldiers who wanted substantial character and higher alcohol content for the price. And, most ambitiously, a slower fermented, longer-aged version intended eventually for wealthier customers who currently wouldn't touch anything associated with orcs, but might reconsider given sufficient quality and proper presentation. This diversification strategy required significant additional infrastructure. Jimin designed separate fermentation schedules and storage systems for each tier, while Bawu trained dedicated brewing teams to specialize in specific product lines rather than everyone attempting identical processes simultaneously. Suwa took charge of quality control specifically for the aged premium batches, understanding that any inconsistency in this higher-stakes product could permanently damage credibility before it even reached potential customers. The sabotaged equipment shipment forced an unexpected but ultimately valuable adaptation. Unable to rely entirely on outside suppliers who could be pressured or bribed by guild interests, Bawu pushed the village toward greater self-sufficiency, having local craftsmen construct replacement equipment using techniques adapted from what Jimin had already learned through months of practical experimentation. This shift, born from necessity, actually strengthened Diakgal's long-term independence, reducing vulnerability to future supply interference. Wusik, meanwhile, developed an informal intelligence network among caravan guards and travelers who had grown genuinely loyal to the product and, by extension, sympathetic toward Diakgal's underdog struggle against an obviously wealthier, more established opponent. Several guards, including Taehyun from their very first successful sale, began voluntarily sharing information about guild movements, planned undercutting locations, and rumor campaigns before they fully materialized, allowing Bawu's team to counter proactively rather than merely reacting after damage occurred. The conflict reached a notable early climax when guild-hired agents attempted direct sabotage against a Diakgal trading cart en route to a new market town, deliberately damaging wheels and attempting to spoil remaining inventory through contamination. Wusik's informal network provided advance warning, allowing Bawu's crew to reroute the shipment and set a deliberate trap, catching 2 guild agents in the act. Rather than violent retaliation, Bawu chose public exposure, presenting the caught agents and evidence of sabotage openly to local authorities and merchants, framing the incident as proof that established interests feared honest competition rather than genuinely believing their own rumors about orc beer's dangers. This exposure backfired significantly against Jaewook's guild, damaging their reputation among neutral merchants who valued fair competition and had grown increasingly annoyed by aggressive tactics disrupting normal trade. Several previously hesitant buyers, moved partly by sympathy for the underdog and partly by curiosity about a product apparently worth this much effort to suppress, began actively seeking out Diakgal's beer specifically, creating exactly the kind of viral interest Bawu had hoped for from the very beginning. Jae-wook, forced to acknowledge that his aggressive tactics had backfired publicly, requested a private meeting with Bawu shortly afterward, his earlier arrogance replaced by grudging, cautious respect. He admitted that Diakgal's product possessed genuine quality he couldn't dismiss any longer, and while he refused to abandon guild loyalty entirely or become an open ally, he proposed an uneasy truce, competing fairly on merit rather than continuing sabotage that had already cost his family's reputation more than any market share it might have protected. Bawu accepted this truce cautiously, understanding that Jae-wook's ambition hadn't disappeared, merely shifted tactics temporarily until circumstances changed again. Still, this represented genuine progress. Diakgal's beer had survived its first serious external attack not through violence or desperation, but through exactly the combination of transparency, strategic diversification, and community loyalty that Bawu had spent months carefully building. That evening, celebrating quietly with his core team over samples of their newest aged batch, Bawu reflected that surviving this guild war had proven something more significant than simple market survival. Diakgal had demonstrated, undeniably, that a village dismissed for generations as incapable could outthink, outadapt, and outlast opponents who possessed every structural advantage except the genuine desire to build something worth defending. Yet even amid this celebration, Bawu remained aware that Jae-wook's truce was fragile, born from tactical necessity rather than genuine acceptance, and that far larger, more dangerous forces than a single ambitious guild heir would eventually notice a poor orc village succeeding where nobody expected success at all. Diakgal's visible prosperity, 6 months after the guild conflict settled into an uneasy truce, had transformed the village almost beyond recognition. New storage buildings stood where crumbling sheds once leaned. Proper wooden houses replaced several of the worst mud and thatch huts. Villagers wore better clothing, ate more reliably, and carried themselves with a confidence that hadn't existed when Bawu first arrived. But this transformation came with a cost nobody had fully anticipated. The old hierarchy that once defined Diakgal's social order was quietly, irreversibly breaking apart. For generations, status in the village had been determined almost entirely by combat prowess and raiding success, regardless of how rarely those raids actually succeeded. Chulwoong's position as chief rested on this exact foundation, his authority rooted in physical dominance and a reputation earned through decades of fighting rather than any particular skill at managing resources or people. Now, however, actual influence within Diakgal flowed increasingly toward those controlling brewing operations, farming reforms, trade logistics, and the wages that came from all three. This shift became impossible to ignore during a village council meeting called to discuss allocation of the growing trade profits. Bawu, Jimin, Woosik, and several other coordinators who had proven themselves through the expanding operation now held informal authority equivalent to or exceeding several of Chulwoong's traditional warrior advisors, simply because they controlled the resources that mattered most to daily survival and continued growth. Sangmin, the farmer who had opposed agricultural reforms months earlier, had shifted his resentment toward this broader power transition, now openly complaining alongside several other traditionalist voices that beer brewers and dirt farmers were replacing warriors as Diakgal's true leadership, an arrangement he considered both humiliating and dangerous given the village's historical vulnerability to raids and territorial disputes. Chulwoong himself, though he had cooperated pragmatically with Bawu's projects for months, began showing visible strain as his own relevance diminished. He remained technically chief, but decisions about grain allocation, trade routes, and even basic village priorities increasingly required consultation with Bawu's group rather than flowing directly from his own authority. During the council meeting, when Bawu proposed allocating additional resources toward expanding the aged premium beer line rather than immediately funding new weapons for the village's small defensive force, Chulwoong reacted with uncharacteristic sharpness, accusing Bawu of forgetting that Diakgal still needed warriors capable of protecting everything they'd built. Bawu, sensing the deeper insecurity behind this outburst, tried to diffuse the tension diplomatically, agreeing that defense mattered but arguing that current trade profits could fund both priorities if managed carefully rather than treating them as competing demands. Chulwoong accepted this compromise publicly, but the underlying tension remained unresolved, simmering beneath the surface of subsequent interactions. The situation escalated dramatically when a small faction of younger warriors, led quietly by a proud, aggressive fighter named Baek Ju-hyuk, began arguing privately that Diakgal no longer needed to rely on slow, careful trade and farming when it now possessed enough wealth and equipment to simply take what it needed through renewed raiding, just as previous generations had attempted, but now with better resources and organization behind them. Ju-hyuk's faction represented a genuine ideological threat rather than simple jealousy. He argued convincingly to several younger, restless orcs that Bawu's entire project, despite its material success, had fundamentally betrayed orc identity, transforming proud warriors into farmers and merchants dependent on outsiders' goodwill rather than their own strength. This argument found particular traction among those who felt sidelined by the new economic hierarchy, warriors whose combat skills no longer translated into the same status or resources they once commanded. Suwa, maintaining close relationships across different village factions through her ongoing work coordinating brewing quality control, warned Bawu directly that Juhyuk's group had grown large enough to represent genuine danger, potentially planning to seize control of trade profits or brewing operations by force rather than continuing to accept diminished status peacefully. Bawu took this warning seriously, understanding from his old-world knowledge of organizational conflict that internal power struggles often proved more dangerous than external threats, since they attacked the very foundation of trust and cooperation that made everything else possible. Rather than confronting Juhyuk directly, which risked escalating tension into open violence prematurely, Bawu focused on strengthening loyalty among the broader village population who had directly benefited from the changes, hoping numbers and genuine goodwill would isolate the radical faction before it could act. This strategy proved only partially successful. 3 weeks after Sua's warning, Juhyuk's faction moved decisively during a night when most of Diakol's coordinators, including Bawu, were occupied preparing a major trade shipment scheduled for departure the following morning. A group of roughly a dozen armed warriors, led by Juhyuk himself, attempted to seize control of the main storage building and brewing facility, intending to claim the accumulated wealth and equipment as rightful spoils belonging to warriors rather than merchants. Woo-sik, who happened to be checking final shipment preparations when the attack began, raised the alarm immediately, shouting loudly enough to wake nearby households before Juhyuk's group could secure the buildings completely. Bawu arrived within minutes, finding a chaotic standoff developing as loyal villagers, alerted by the commotion, began gathering to defend the facilities that represented months of collective effort and genuine improvement in their daily lives. The confrontation that followed was tense and dangerous, though Bawu deliberately avoided framing it as a battle to be won through combat skill alone, recognizing correctly that neither he nor most of his core team possessed genuine fighting ability compared to trained warriors like Juhyuk's faction. Instead, he relied on numbers, positioning, and psychological pressure, having Woo-sik organize villagers to surround the contested buildings from multiple directions while Jimin quickly barricaded critical brewing equipment against potential destruction. Chol-won, forced to choose decisively in this moment despite his earlier resentment toward diminished authority, ultimately sided against Juhyuk's faction, recognizing correctly that allowing a violent seizure of village resources would destroy everything Diakol had built regardless of who ultimately claimed victory. His public stance, backed by his own remaining combat reputation, proved crucial in convincing several wavering villagers to actively resist rather than remain passively neutral during the standoff. The actual physical confrontation, when it finally erupted, was brief but genuinely dangerous. Juhyuk's warriors, though outnumbered by the gathering crowd of ordinary villagers, possessed significant combat advantage in direct one-on-one confrontation. Chol-won personally engaged Juhyuk in the most intense exchange, their fight lasting several tense minutes before Chol-won, despite his age, ultimately overpowered the younger warrior through experience and sheer determination rather than raw physical superiority. With their leader defeated and surrounded by a clearly hostile majority of villagers who had directly benefited from Bawu's reforms, the remaining rebels surrendered rather than continuing what had become an obviously lost confrontation. Nobody died during the fight, though several participants on both sides suffered serious injuries, including Chol-won himself, who bore a deep gash along his forearm that would leave a permanent scar. The aftermath required careful, deliberate handling to avoid deepening village divisions permanently. Bawu argued against harsh punishment for most participants, recognizing that many had joined Juhyuk's faction out of genuine insecurity about their diminished status rather than pure malice, and that public execution or exile would likely create lasting resentment rather than genuine resolution. Instead, he proposed integrating disaffected warriors into the growing trade operations security needs, offering Juhyuk's former followers legitimate, respected roles protecting caravans and facilities rather than remaining marginalized outside the new economic system entirely. Juhyuk himself received harsher treatment, exiled from Diakol permanently given his direct leadership role in the attempted violent takeover, though Chol-won, showing surprising mercy given his own injuries, allowed him to leave with basic supplies rather than facing execution that traditional orc justice might have demanded. This resolution, imperfect and uncomfortable as it was, achieved something crucial. It demonstrated publicly that Diakol's new order, however different from traditional warrior-based hierarchy, could still defend itself and maintain internal stability without requiring the same brutal enforcement methods the village had relied on previously. Warriors who had felt genuinely threatened by economic transformation now found meaningful, respected roles within that same transformed system, rather than remaining permanently alienated outsiders. Shulwang, recovering from his injury over the following weeks, approached Ba Wu with uncharacteristic openness, admitting that he'd spent months resenting his own diminishing relevance without fully acknowledging it, and that watching his own people nearly tear the village apart over exactly this insecurity had forced him to reconsider what leadership actually meant in this new reality. He proposed, somewhat awkwardly, a more formal power-sharing arrangement, acknowledging Ba Wu's practical authority over economic matters while retaining his own traditional role overseeing defense, diplomacy, and cultural continuity. Ba Wu accepted this arrangement readily, understanding that genuine stability required exactly this kind of shared legitimacy rather than any single source of authority, however successful, attempting to govern everything alone. Sitting together that evening, watching villagers slowly repair the minor damage from the previous night's confrontation, both men understood that surviving this internal crisis had cost them something important, but had also proven, more convincingly than any trade success or brewing triumph, that Diakol possessed the resilience necessary to endure far greater challenges still waiting on the horizon. The power-sharing arrangement between Ba Wu and Shulwang stabilized Diakol internally, but external pressure arrived almost immediately afterward, as if the village's growing visibility had simply been waiting for internal weakness to fade before applying serious force. Within a month, 3 separate powers converged on Diakol's success simultaneously: the regional baron, a traveling church inquisitor, and organized banditry targeting trade routes that had grown increasingly lucrative. The baron's representative arrived first, a formally dressed administrator named Cho Yunsuk, accompanied by a small honor guard meant to project authority rather than genuine military threat. Yunsuk's message was direct. The Baron had noticed Diakol's rapidly growing trade wealth and demanded formal tribute, framed diplomatically as appropriate taxation but functioning essentially as extortion, given that Diakol had never previously registered as a taxable settlement under the Baron's jurisdiction. Ba Wu, now experienced enough in outside negotiation to recognize both danger and opportunity in this demand, negotiated carefully rather than refusing outright, understanding that open defiance against baronial authority risked military retaliation Diakol couldn't currently survive. He agreed to a tribute percentage, though negotiated it down significantly from Yunsuk's initial demand by emphasizing how continued independent prosperity would ultimately generate more long-term tax revenue than a heavy-handed extraction that might cripple the very operation generating wealth in the first place. Yunsuk, pragmatic despite his formal demeanor, accepted this compromise, though he warned clearly that the Baron would expect steady, reliable payments moving forward, and that any sign of hidden wealth or underreported trade would result in far harsher consequences. This arrangement, while costly, provided Diakol something valuable: nominal legitimacy under baronial protection, theoretically reducing vulnerability to smaller predatory threats who might otherwise target an unprotected settlement. The church's intervention proved considerably more complicated. A traveling inquisitor named Brother Son Minjae arrived roughly 2 weeks after Yunsuk's visit, having heard troubling reports about an orc-brewed beverage supposedly causing unnatural vigor and resistance to illness among its drinkers, rumors that had evolved significantly from the guild's earlier sabotage campaign into something approaching religious concern about unnatural or demonic influence. Minjae's investigation was methodical and unsettling, questioning villagers directly about specific effects they'd experienced, examining brewing equipment with suspicious intensity, and eventually requesting to taste the beer himself under careful observation. Ba Wu, aware that outright refusal would only deepen suspicion, agreed to full transparency, walking Minjae through every step of the brewing process personally, emphasizing natural ingredients and explainable fermentation science rather than anything supernatural. This transparency partially satisfied Minjae's investigation, though he remained troubled by persistent reports of drinkers experiencing genuine health improvements beyond what ordinary beer should reasonably provide. Ba Wu, forced to confront a question he'd been avoiding since first noticing unusually consistent positive health outcomes among long-term drinkers, admitted honestly that he didn't fully understand why the effects seemed stronger than typical beer benefits, speculating only that the spring water source might possess unusual mineral qualities beyond ordinary understanding. This admission, rather than reassuring Minjae, deepened his concern considerably, since unexplained beneficial properties in a substance associated with orcs fit uncomfortably into existing church doctrine about unnatural, potentially dangerous phenomena requiring careful control rather than free circulation among the general population. Min-jae departed without immediately condemning the beer outright, but warned that he would report his findings to church superiors, hinting strongly that formal religious restriction or condemnation remained a genuine possibility depending on how church authorities interpreted his ambiguous findings. Bawu, deeply unsettled by this development, began investigating the spring source more seriously himself, accompanied by Jimin, who had developed genuine expertise in practical experimentation throughout their ongoing brewing refinements. Their informal investigation, conducted using nothing more sophisticated than careful observation and comparison against water from other nearby sources, revealed subtle but real differences. The spring water dissolved certain minerals unusually well, left faint mineral deposits with a slight, unusual shimmer when boiled down completely, and seemed to interact with the wild hop-like plants growing nearby in ways that produced noticeably stronger fermentation activity compared to identical recipes attempted with ordinary water elsewhere. This discovery, while fascinating, complicated matters significantly rather than resolving anything. If the spring genuinely possessed unusual properties beyond normal water, it meant Diakgal's entire success rested not merely on Bawu's knowledge and the village's hard work, but on a genuinely rare, potentially strategic natural resource that powerful outside interests would eventually recognize as worth controlling directly rather than simply taxing indirectly through trade. Before Bawu could fully process the implications of this discovery, the third external threat materialized violently. A significant bandit force, apparently organized specifically around targeting Diakgal's now valuable trade caravans, ambushed a shipment 3 days into its journey toward a growing customer base in a mid-sized town called Baekrang, roughly 2 days beyond Hanmakgal. The ambush proved devastating initially. Bandits, well-armed and clearly informed about the caravan's route and schedule, overwhelmed the modest guard escort Bawu had assigned, killing 2 guards and seriously wounding several others before making off with roughly half the shipment's inventory and severely damaging equipment they couldn't easily carry away. Woo-sik, who had personally organized the guard rotation for this particular shipment, blamed himself heavily for the losses, though investigation afterward revealed the ambush had been planned with suspiciously precise knowledge of route, timing, and cargo value that suggested inside information rather than simple opportunistic banditry. This suspicion led to a difficult, uncomfortable investigation within Diakgal itself, examining who among trusted personnel might have leaked sensitive shipment details to outside parties. The eventual discovery proved painful. A young orc named Jang Do-yun, one of the guards who survived the ambush with relatively minor injuries, had been secretly providing information to bandit intermediaries for weeks, motivated by personal debts and resentment over feeling perpetually underpaid compared to the increasingly wealthy coordinators managing brewing and trade operations. Bawu, confronting Do-yun directly once evidence became undeniable, felt genuine sympathy alongside justified anger, recognizing that Do-yun's betrayal stemmed from real grievances about compensation fairness rather than pure malice, even though the consequences had proven genuinely deadly for fellow guards who trusted him. Cholwon, drawing on traditional authorities still respected regarding matters of village security and betrayal, insisted on formal punishment despite Bawu's private reservations, ultimately exiling Do-yun rather than executing him, though the decision remained controversial among villagers who felt exile represented insufficient consequence for actions that had gotten people killed. This internal betrayal forced Bawu to confront an uncomfortable truth about rapid growth. Expanding wealth and complexity had outpaced the fair, transparent compensation structures needed to maintain genuine loyalty throughout the operation. He implemented significant reforms afterward, establishing clearer profit-sharing arrangements for guards, farmers, and brewers alike, ensuring that everyone contributing meaningfully to Diakgal's success received compensation reflecting that contribution rather than allowing resentment to fester dangerously beneath surface prosperity. Simultaneously, Bawu strengthened caravan security more broadly, working with Cholwon to train a dedicated protection force drawing partly from former warriors who had joined Juhyuk's failed rebellion months earlier, now given legitimate, respected purpose defending the very trade routes that had once seemed like betrayal of traditional orc identity. This integration proved surprisingly effective, channeling combat skill and warrior pride into protecting Diakgal's economic lifeline rather than opposing it. By the time these combined crises finally settled into manageable resolution, Bawu understood clearly that Diakgal's transformation from ignored, impoverished village into genuine regional economic force had permanently changed the nature of every challenge facing them. Simple survival problems like bad water and rotting grain had been replaced by geopolitical complexity involving baronial taxation, religious suspicion, organized banditry, and the unsettling possibility that their entire success rested on a genuinely magical resource that powerful interests would eventually recognize and seek to control directly. Sitting alone that evening beside the very spring that had started everything months earlier, watching faint mineral shimmer catch the last light of sunset across the water's surface, Bawu felt the full weight of what he'd built settling uncomfortably across his shoulders. They had survived guild sabotage, internal rebellion, baronial extortion, religious suspicion, and organized banditry all within roughly a year. But each survival had revealed larger, more dangerous forces waiting just beyond the horizon, and Bawu couldn't escape the growing certainty that Diakol's greatest tests, rather than nearing conclusion, had barely even begun. The royal delegation arrived without warning, though in hindsight, Bawu realized the warning signs had been accumulating for weeks: increased baronial correspondence requesting detailed production figures, unusually formal merchants passing through Hanmakal asking pointed questions about Diakol's spring source, and a subtle but noticeable increase in strangers observing the village from a careful distance rather than approaching directly. When the delegation finally revealed itself, it arrived with enough ceremonial weight to make clear that whatever came next would not be a simple negotiation. The delegation consisted of roughly 20 riders, led by an imperial administrator named Baek Wonjae, dressed in fine traveling clothes marked with royal insignia, accompanied by 2 court degustators, several armed escorts, and, disturbingly, a robed figure introduced only as an imperial resource examiner, a title Bawu immediately suspected referred to someone trained in identifying and evaluating magical properties in natural materials. Wonjae's opening address to Chulwung and Bawu, delivered in the village's central gathering space with deliberate formality, framed the visit as an honor rather than an intrusion. The crown, he explained, had received multiple reports about a remarkable beverage originating from an orc settlement, reports significant enough to warrant direct imperial interest rather than leaving the matter to regional baronial administration alone. Bawu recognized immediately the danger hidden beneath this diplomatic framing. Imperial interest in a local product rarely meant simple appreciation; it typically meant the crown had identified something valuable enough to justify direct control, whether through forced monopoly, outright seizure, or an arrangement so restrictive it amounted to servitude dressed in prestigious language. He maintained careful composure throughout the formal welcome, offering hospitality without revealing the growing unease building beneath his diplomatic exterior. The imperial degustators, testing several beer varieties over the following 2 days with meticulous, almost theatrical seriousness, confirmed publicly what Bawu already knew privately: the product possessed genuine, exceptional quality across multiple tiers, from the affordable laborer's variety to the increasingly refined aged premium batches Suwa had spent months perfecting. Their formal assessment praised the beer's balance, character, and remarkable consistency for what they considered unconventional provincial production, language that managed to compliment and condescend simultaneously. The resource examiner's investigation proved far more concerning. Working quietly away from public ceremony, the robed figure spent considerable time near the spring itself, conducting tests Bawu couldn't fully understand, involving strange instruments and careful sample collection. When Wonjae finally revealed the examiner's findings during a private meeting with Bawu and Chulwung, the confirmation landed with the weight Bawu had feared since first suspecting unusual mineral properties months earlier. The spring, according to imperial assessment, contained genuine trace magical properties connected to deep geological formations rarely found accessible near the surface, properties that explained the beer's unusual health benefits and could theoretically be refined further for more directly magical applications beyond simple brewing. This confirmation transformed Diakol's situation entirely, elevating their beer from valuable regional commodity to genuine strategic resource with implications extending toward medicine, military logistics, and potentially even magical research the Empire would consider far too significant to leave under independent orc control. Wonjae's subsequent proposal, delivered with practiced diplomatic smoothness, offered Bawu and Diakol what he framed as generous royal recognition, official status as exclusive imperial suppliers, guaranteed protection under direct crown authority, substantial ongoing payment for continued production, and formal titles elevating Bawu and Chulwung to recognized nobility status within the region, an almost unthinkable honor for orcs under normal circumstances. The catch, buried within layers of generous-sounding language, became clear once Bawu pressed for specific details. Exclusive imperial supply meant the crown would control distribution entirely, dictating exactly how much beer Diakol could produce, who could purchase it, and at what price, effectively ending the independent trade network Bawu had spent over a year building. Direct crown protection meant permanent imperial oversight, including regular inspections, mandatory reporting, and almost certainly eventual restriction on expanding production beyond what the Empire deemed appropriate to maintain scarcity and strategic value. And the promised nobility titles, while flattering, would bind Bawu and Chulwung personally to imperial service, making refusal or future independence essentially impossible without committing treason against the very authority granting their new status. Bawu requested time to consider the offer properly, a request Wonjae granted with visible reluctance, making clear that imperial patience, while currently generous, wouldn't remain indefinitely available given the crown's serious interest in securing this resource before rival powers or ambitious nobles attempted similar approaches independently. That evening, gathering his core advisors, Chulwang, Wusik, Jimin, and Suab Bawu laid out the situation honestly, including the genuinely difficult calculation involved. Refusing outright risked immediate, severe imperial retaliation, potentially including forced seizure of the spring itself and the village's complete destruction if the crown decided independent orc control over a strategic magical resource represented unacceptable risk. Accepting fully meant trading hard-won independence for comfortable, permanent servitude, transforming Diakol from a free, self-determined community into essentially an imperial production facility with orc laborers. Chulwang, surprising Bawu with strategic thinking that went beyond his traditional warrior instincts, suggested a third path, neither full acceptance nor outright refusal, but careful negotiation aimed at preserving as much genuine autonomy as possible while offering the crown enough formal recognition and controlled access to satisfy their strategic interests without complete surrender. This became the foundation of Bawu's counter-proposal, developed over several tense days of careful drafting and consultation. Rather than exclusive imperial supply, he proposed a formal trade agreement granting the crown priority access and preferential pricing for military and medical applications, while preserving Diakgol's ability to continue independent commercial trade through existing networks. Rather than direct imperial administrative control, he proposed a formal alliance structure, similar to how certain independent trading cities maintain self-governance while acknowledging broader imperial authority through treaty rather than direct subjugation. Regarding the spring itself, Bawu made perhaps his most delicate argument, warning diplomatically that any attempt to relocate production, extract the spring's resources through force, or replace Diakgol's existing brewing expertise with imperial administrators risked destroying the very qualities that made the resource valuable in the first place. He emphasized, truthfully, that the magical properties interacted specifically with brewing techniques refined through months of careful experimentation, techniques that existed primarily in his own knowledge and his team's accumulated practical experience rather than any easily transferable formula. This argument, while genuinely persuasive from a practical standpoint, also functioned as calculated leverage, making clear implicitly that forcing Diakgol into complete submission risked killing the golden goose the Empire had traveled so far to acquire. Wonjae's response to this counterproposal remained non-committal initially, clearly recognizing both its practical merit and its implicit challenge to imperial authority. He requested formal consultation with his superiors before providing any definitive answer, departing Diakgol after nearly 2 weeks of tense negotiation with promises to return within a month carrying the crown's final decision. This delay provided Bawu crucial breathing room, though it hardly resolved the underlying danger. He used the time productively, strengthening Diakgol's negotiating position through several parallel efforts. He reached out discreetly to Han Jae-wook, his former guild rival turned uneasy ally, proposing a formal business partnership that would demonstrate Diakgol's continued independent commercial viability rather than desperate dependence on imperial favor alone. Jae-wook, recognizing genuine mutual benefit in aligning against overwhelming imperial control that would eventually threaten his own guild's independence as well, agreed readily, providing valuable additional legitimacy and market access beyond what Diakgol could achieve alone. Simultaneously, Bawu worked with Chulwang to strengthen defensive capabilities discreetly, not through open military buildup that would provoke imperial suspicion, but through improved fortification, expanded and better trained guard forces integrated from former rebels, and careful diplomatic outreach toward neighboring settlements who might prove sympathetic allies if imperial pressure escalated toward outright confrontation rather than negotiated compromise. As the month-long deadline approached, Bawu found himself facing the most consequential decision since arriving in this world. Every previous challenge, bad water, failed brewing attempts, guild sabotage, internal rebellion, bandit betrayal, had ultimately been survivable through cleverness, hard work, and community resilience. This confrontation felt fundamentally different, involving forces powerful enough to simply eliminate Diakgol's independence entirely regardless of how cleverly Bawu negotiated, if the crown ultimately decided direct control mattered more than diplomatic goodwill. Standing again beside the spring that had started everything, watching Suwa oversee a fresh batch of premium beer with the confident expertise she'd developed over the past year, Bawu understood clearly that whatever answer arrived when Wonjae returned would determine not just Diakgol's commercial future, but whether the entire project he'd built represented genuine liberation for his adopted people, or merely a more comfortable, more prestigious form of the same subjugation orcs had endured for generations under different names. 1J returned exactly 1 month later, but not alone. Alongside his original delegation rode a larger contingent, including armed soldiers, a second imperial administrator with visibly higher rank, and, most troubling, Han Jae-wook's guild rival faction represented by an older, senior guild master named Han Tae-sung, Jae-wook's own uncle, apparently recruited by imperial interests specifically to argue that established human brewing houses could replicate or improve upon Diakgol's methods if given controlled access to the spring directly, rendering continued orc independence unnecessary. This development revealed exactly the danger Bawu had feared throughout the negotiation period. The Empire hadn't simply been deliberating a decision, it had been quietly building alternative options to pressure Diakgol into accepting unfavorable terms, or to justify seizing the spring outright if negotiation failed entirely. The senior administrator, introduced as Lord Advisor Song Kangho, wasted little time on diplomatic pleasantries. He presented Diakgol with a substantially harsher revised proposal: immediate transfer of spring access rights to imperial oversight, mandatory relocation of core brewing operations to a facility near the capital where imperial administrators could directly supervise production, and integration of Taesung's guild expertise to improve efficiency and consistency, terms that amounted to complete extraction of everything Bawu had built, leaving Diakgol with nothing but a modest ongoing stipend. In exchange for permanent loss of both the resource and the knowledge that made it valuable. Bawu recognized immediately that accepting this revised proposal meant genuine catastrophe, not merely uncomfortable compromise. He also recognized, watching Kangho's confident, almost dismissive posture, that direct confrontation without leverage would accomplish nothing beyond confirming imperial assumptions that orcs lacked the sophistication to negotiate as genuine equals. Fortunately, the weeks of preparation hadn't been wasted. Bawu activated the alliances he'd carefully built during the negotiation delay. Jae-wook, informed in advance about his uncle's involvement, arrived personally at Diakgol just as the tense confrontation began, publicly contradicting Taesung's claims that human guild expertise could simply replicate Diakgol's results without the specific knowledge, relationship with the land, and accumulated experimental refinement that Bawu's team possessed. Jae-wook's direct testimony, coming from a respected guild figure who had personally competed against and ultimately allied with Diakgol, carried significant weight against his own uncle's self-interested claims. Simultaneously, representatives from several neighboring settlements that had grown to depend economically on Diakgol's trade network arrived, having been quietly informed beforehand about the potential imperial seizure and its likely disruption to regional trade stability. Their presence, framed carefully as concerned neutral parties rather than active political opposition, demonstrated to Kangho that forcibly disrupting Diakgol's operation would create broader economic instability extending well beyond a single orc village, complicating the Empire's calculation considerably. Bawu then revealed his most carefully prepared argument, one he'd developed specifically anticipating exactly this kind of aggressive pressure. He proposed a live demonstration, allow Taesung's Guild Experts Limited, supervised access to attempt replicating Diakgol's premium aged beer using identical spring water but without Bawu's specific fermentation techniques and timing knowledge, comparing the results directly against Diakgol's established product. Kangho, confident in imperial resources and human guild expertise, agreed to this proposal, likely assuming it would demonstrate that skilled brewers could match or exceed orc methods once given proper access. The demonstration, conducted over several tense days under close observation from both parties, produced exactly the result Bawu had anticipated based on his own hard-won understanding of the process. Taesung's guild experts, despite genuine skill and resources, produced a noticeably inferior product, missing the subtle balance between fermentation timing, specific hop-like plant preparation, and mineral interaction that Bawu's team had refined through over a year of careful, often painful trial and error. This failure, witnessed directly by Kangho and several other imperial observers, fundamentally undermined the argument that orc expertise could simply be extracted and replaced. Taesung, embarrassed and defensive, attempted to argue the difference was minor or could be corrected with more time, but the visible, tasteable gap in quality spoke louder than any face-saving explanation he offered. With this crucial leverage established, Bawu pressed forward with his original counter-proposal from weeks earlier, now reinforced by undeniable practical evidence rather than mere diplomatic argument. He reiterated the offer of priority imperial access, preferential military and medical supply agreements, and formal treaty-based alliance rather than direct subjugation, emphasizing again that Diakgol's continued independent operation, motivated by genuine investment in their own success rather than coerced labor, represented far greater long-term value to the empire than a forcibly extracted operation likely to produce inferior results. Kangho, forced to reconsider given the demonstration's undeniable outcome and the visible complexity of disrupting broader regional trade relationships, requested a private consultation with 1J before responding formally. Their discussion, conducted away from Diakol's leadership, remained unknown in detail, but when Kang Ho returned, his position had shifted noticeably, though not without extracting additional concessions to preserve imperial dignity in what had effectively become a negotiated retreat from the harsher original demands. The final agreement, formalized over the following days through careful, detailed negotiation, established Diakol as a formally recognized independent trading settlement under a treaty relationship with the crown rather than direct subjugation. The empire received guaranteed priority access to premium beer supplies for military and medical purposes at negotiated rates, along with formal tribute payments similar to what had already been established with the regional baron. In exchange, Diakol retained full control over the spring, brewing operations, and independent commercial trade rights, along with formal recognition as a legitimate settlement rather than an unregulated, vulnerable orc village existing at the mercy of whoever noticed its growing wealth. Shulwang and Bawu received honorary recognition rather than binding noble titles, a compromise allowing the empire to claim credit for elevating orc status without creating the kind of permanent personal obligation that full nobility would have demanded. This arrangement, while imperfect and still leaving Diakol formally subordinate to broader imperial authority in certain limited respects, preserved the essential independence and self-determination that had defined the entire project since Bawu's first desperate attempt to boil contaminated swamp water over a year earlier. As the imperial delegation finally departed, taking Taesung's humiliated guild experts and Kang Ho's grudging acceptance back toward the capital, Bawu stood beside Chulwang watching the dust settle along the village's main path, feeling something he hadn't quite allowed himself to experience during the tense weeks of negotiation: genuine, exhausted relief. That evening, Diakol held an impromptu celebration, less formal than previous milestones but perhaps more emotionally significant, given how close everything had come to complete loss just weeks earlier. Sua's father, Diakpal, now fully recovered and remarkably healthy for a man who had once seemed permanently sickly, raised a cup of the very beer that had started this entire transformation, toasting not to wealth or victory over powerful enemies, but simply to having a future worth building at all, something Diakol's people hadn't genuinely believed possible before Bawu's arrival. Wusik, now confidently managing significant portions of the trade network he'd once approached with nervous uncertainty, reflected quietly to Bawu that none of them had truly understood, when this all began with a single failed batch of contaminated beer, exactly how far this journey would eventually lead. Jimin, examining a newly designed sealing mechanism for expanded production even amid the celebration, admitted with characteristic practicality that survival didn't mean the challenges were finished, merely that Diakol had proven, repeatedly, its capacity to meet whatever challenges arrived next. Bawu, standing quietly apart from the celebration for a moment, looked out across a village utterly transformed from the desperate, disease-ridden settlement he'd woken up in over a year earlier. Clean water flowed freely now, no longer the desperate innovation of a confused, weak newcomer, but simply an accepted, unremarkable feature of daily life. Prosperous fields, once barren and exhausted, produced genuine surplus. A once despised people had built something powerful enough to negotiate directly with an empire and walk away with their independence intact. Yet even amid this hard-won victory, Bawu understood clearly that this resolution represented not an ending, but merely the conclusion of Diakol's first great trial. The empire's grudging acceptance remained fragile, dependent on continued demonstrated value and careful diplomatic maintenance. Rival guilds, ambitious nobles, and other unknown forces would inevitably notice Diakol's continued success and attempt their own approaches, whether through renewed sabotage, more sophisticated political maneuvering, or entirely new forms of pressure nobody had yet anticipated. Still, watching Chulwang laugh genuinely for the first time in months, watching Sua proudly explain fermentation timing to curious village children who had grown up never knowing Diakol as anything other than a place capable of remarkable achievement, Bawu allowed himself, finally, a moment of genuine satisfaction rather than anxious calculation about what challenge might arrive next. He had come to this world as a dying man convinced his life's work meant nothing beyond momentary pleasure for people who would forget it within a generation. Instead, he'd built something that had transformed an entire community's fundamental relationship with survival, dignity, and self-determination, proving decisively that even the most dismissed, overlooked people could reshape their own destiny when given genuine knowledge, opportunity, and the stubborn refusal to accept that their worth was already decided by others. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges Diakol couldn't yet fully anticipate. But for the first time since waking up in this strange new body and strange new world, Bawu felt genuinely confident that whatever came next, this village, his village now, in every way that mattered, possessed exactly what it needed to face it.